So, King Louis, what did he call when he wanted to maybe tax the nobles and the clergy? The Assembly of Notables. Very, very good. So with the Assembly of Notables, he was hoping to get representatives from the nobility and the church to agree to be taxed. And let's do a little experiment right now. Can I tax you? No. That's exactly what they said, right? How much money would you like me to take? How about none? How about you leave us alone? Or maybe I'll let you tax me a little bit more, but maybe I'll get some political reform. Maybe, we get things like trial by jury. Maybe you won't be such an absolute monarch. Oh. And they say, he's like, yeah, nah, let's try something else. And I want to segue into this gentleman as a representation of kind of what's to come. This gentleman here is Louis Philippe II, the Duc d'Orléans, the Duke of Orleans. A relative of the king, he was a nobleman, he was super wealthy, he was someone who owned something called the Palais Royal. There was an arcade, there were theaters, there was opera, there was gambling, there was drinking, a place where everyone in Paris went to go and discuss politics and have a bit of a nightlife. And this gentleman, even though he was born into wealth and prestige and privilege, was so moved by Enlightenment values that he changed his name from Louis Duc d'Orléans to Philippe Égalité. Equality, right? So I'm not like the other nobles. I'm someone who wants to have equality. I want to lift up the third estate. Interesting thing about this gentleman is that he is so into the French Revolution and getting rid of monarchy as things progress that he actually votes for King Louis XVI to be guillotined, to have his head cut off. And he's his own family. That's intense, right? In the same sense, though, later on, because he's too close to the monarchy, he will also have his head cut off. His son will later be king. So we have the calling of the Estates General, the king's advisory body politic that didn't really hold any power. They were more advising the king. They could vote on things, they could pass resolutions, but they didn't really have any governing power. And the king is trying to assemble these guys and pretty much tell me what's wrong with France, and let's see if you guys can fix it. Are there any ideas, any things that we can do, or any structural changes? And the king opens the door to sharing political power. And do you see the hall? That was the warehouse where there used to be old opera props and everything. So they actually took this opera warehouse, emptied it out, turned it into this lavish, huge, parliamentary hall where there's silk everywhere, there's gold everywhere, there's paintings of French kings. And what ends up happening is that he is kind of opening the doors to all of the pent-up anger, rage, frustration of the lower class, the nobles, and the clergy, because the Estates General has not met in over 100 years. And if we think about when they called for the Estates General, this ignited a political discussion in France. So 1/2 of the men in France could read, 1/3 of the women could read. And if we think about it, there were over 1,500 pamphlets that appeared in the last 6 months of 1788 discussing politics. This is something that people were all publishing their ideas about. They were widely read, vivid discussion back and forth. And then in April of 1789, which is a crucial year, need to know, storming of the Bastille, a lot of action, 2,700 pamphlets. A group called the Princes of the Blood, people loyal to the king, related to the king, said, there's going to be revolution. You need to watch it. There needs to be some reform. And when people meet, when they're going to meet, one of the things they do is they want to talk about reforming France, and they are using an outdated political system, right? Can you imagine if we used a political system in which we were using the same political structure as 150, 175 years ago? We are, but there have been significant constitutional amendments. But if we think about it, if we were using the laws from 150 years ago, we're kind of borderline, it's okay to own slaves and have slave state representation in the Union. Do things change in 150 years? Yeah, there's a lot of change, right? A lot of things change, and we've gone through the Enlightenment. So the old estate, the old way that this Estates Generale would work is that the clergy would vote in one voting block. So all people connected to the church, they would have a vote, and that one vote was kind of one decision. After that, the nobility, they would all vote in one block, and that vote would be one decision. And then those two only made up roughly 3% of the population. 97%, everybody else voted, had their own delegates, but they all still only got one vote. So if we think about that system, what can always happen to the will of the nation, the will of the people? When you have the upper classes, when you have the nobility, the aristocracy in agreement with each other, there's absolutely no check on their power that the lower classes have, unless they go directly through the king. So this group called the bourgeoisie, which is French for professional class. So those are merchants, lawyers, professors, people with a bit of wealth. They start to represent this third estate, right? And in this third estate, what they're saying is we need grievances. We need to tell the king what's wrong. We need to propose these reforms. And if you were a 25-year-old aged male and you had a bit of wealth to your name, you were not an actor or bankrupt, you could vote and elect delegates to represent you. They would call up these grievance lists. And what ended up happening was when they were there, they wanted to reform the system. Let's jump back for a moment. If we think about this gentleman, Abbé Sieyès, what did he say, if we go back to your homework, about the third estate? What is the third estate? Yes. So Abbé Sieyès, very influential. So what is the third estate? It is everything that is politically just about nothing. We need to switch that. What has been the political order until now? It's nothing. We need it to become something. And he says that in a revolutionary idea that the third estate nourishes and vivifies the kingdom. He dismissed nobles as useless consumers who lived off the stolen labor and wealth of others who don't really do anything for France, and that sovereignty doesn't lie in the king or lie with the nobles or the clergy, that the power, the decision-making of this country should be with the people, the nation. They should make decisions for themselves. He was widely popular, and because of people like him, people call for reform. So you get things like reform proposals like this. Maybe we'll just appease the third estate by doubling the third estate. So we won't even give them a third kind of final say or another final say. We'll just give them more delegates. Does that seem like any significant change? In the end, no. Definitely not. We have another reform proposal where they vote by head. So each one delegate, one vote. Okay. Would the aristocrats want this?
No.
Definitely not. So in a single assembly, individual nobles and priests could vote with the third estate if they wanted to. And what the king decides to do is that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to double the third. We'll give them a little bit of, I guess, throw them a bone, but not really. And then vote by head, no way. Also another thing for Louis. Louis actually leaves this Estates Generale. His young son, was dying of tuberculosis and actually will soon pass away. So he's dealing with his dying son. He's dealing with the death and the grief of a dead child, which is absolutely horrible, while France is falling apart around him. So he's not very active. He's not engaged. He's not giving a lot of leadership. So that means the Estates Generale is going to go a little crazy. It's kind of like, dad's away or mom's away. So we're going to see what we can get away with, So now we have twice as many angry delegates. So, okay, instead of just appeasing people, what you have done is now just really invited more angry people into your hall. So they have grievance lists against unfair taxes. They don't like the feudal system that is still kind of in effect. They wanted a meritocracy. Peasants wanted access to hunting and fishing. They wanted common grazing lands for their cattle. They raged against doves and rabbits that destroyed their crops. And all of these different groups had different ideas of what they actually wanted. And then here's an actual painting of the Third Estate, what it looked like. The States General, what it looked like. You had the clergy on one side, you had the nobles on another side, and who was furthest away from the king? The Third Estate. Excellent. And it gets really terrible. There was actually one nobleman that was making a speech, and he argued that the nobles were a superior race to the common people, and that they have different blood, to which someone in the Third Estate said, It is not, you are not noble, you are no better than me, and things were getting very heated with each other. There were 2,000 spectators in the balconies. When the Third Estate would talk about ideas, they would invite people in, and they got the nation energized, whereas the nobility and the clergy kept things all under wraps. So the Third Estate is kind of learning how to get the consent of the nation, control public opinion, go directly to the people instead of through the proper political channels of the time. And what they do is they say, you know what, we're not getting the reforms we want, the reforms we need, so we're kind of breaking off. We are going to, as the Third Estate, go and have our own assembly, and if you're a liberal noble or a good clergyman, you can join us. Some clergymen do, some nobles like Philippe Égalité ends up joining, and we get the creation of a new governing politic known as the National Assembly, where they say, join us, and some people do defect to their side. There was one large man known as Count de Mirabeau. This Mirabeau was a huge guy. He was someone who had been imprisoned for sleeping with a married woman. He had scars all over his face, a big booming voice, a leading voice against monarchy, against privilege. And he famously stated, if I am a mad dog against despotism and privilege, then I will bite it. Then it will die of my bite. There we go. So someone who was intense, kind of a rebel leader, and they are starting to try and pass their own laws and reform. And King Louis says, I didn't give them authority to do this. They have no jurisdiction. And instead of showing up and dealing with the situation, he just locks them out of the hall. He says, you know what? Just lock them out. We don't need to deal with them. He was dealing with his son dying of tuberculosis. 3 days after they created this National Assembly, they were locked out. Yes?
Which king is this?
King Louis XVI. Great question. And yes,
What was that?
the National Assembly. So the people of the first, second, and third estates, mostly third, that are proposing more radical political reforms. So when they're locked out, where they go is they say, you know what? I'm going to go somewhere else. You tried to abolish our assembly, but we are the will of the people, the voice of the people, and we, the National Assembly, are going to meet in a tennis court. So they meet in a different area and take something known as the tennis court oath. Say that 3 times fast. In which they pledged not to adjourn until they had adopted a constitution for France. Kind of turning them into what England was, a constitutional monarchy. Maybe they'd have to call a parliament in order to have taxes or reform. So there they are taking their oath. You can see their arms are stretched out toward the main speaker, that they are taking this oath. Many of them would have had tears in their eyes. Long live the nation, long live the king. Many of them were saying that, hail to the king, we love the king, though they did not necessarily know how he would fit into this new political system and political reform, but they knew that he opened the door to this situation. And many of them wanted to at least work with the crown in the beginning. Eventually, King Louis says, you know what? Fine. This National Assembly has been created. They're done with the Estates General. We'll use their system. We'll allow them to make decisions. They can create some proposals, maybe get us out of this mess, and I will give them my blessing. Someone like Marquis de Lafayette, who was a noble, said, I want to join the National Assembly, but I'm not going to do it until I have the king's blessing, after which he joins. So he recognizes the National Assembly as a law-making body and directed the remaining members of the First and Second Estates to join their assembly. So that's a lot of change, right? A lot going on in a little amount of time. Drastic. You think the king might be a little worried? He's calling in the troops. So even though, right, he is allowing all of these different reforms, even though he's allowing and sanctioning this National Assembly, he's still calling in troops around Versailles and around Paris. And couple this with the fact that the cost of bread is rising, famine is on the horizon. There have already been bread riots in Lyon, France's second most populated city, and troops had to already accompany food convoys in and out of major cities. You have debt, you have famine, you have political strife that is going to erupt, which we'll talk about next time, in the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, when you really have the outbreak of violence and the outbreak of revolution. The leader of the Bastille gets his head cut off with a pocket knife. And then they parade his head around the city. The guy who does it drinks wine and gunpowder, so he has the fire in his belly to actually finish the job of decapitating this guy. And things are going to get a little crazy in old Paris